Is it? I can see. No, I'm ready. I think we're ready. Do you want to make sure that that picture is right? Or you got it?
It's gonna adjust. That's the camera, so it should be you. I don't know why.
All right, why is it? Oh, there it goes.
Oh, you know why?
That's my back. That's weird.
I think
It's delayed. It's delayed. It's delayed.
it is delayed. It's the latency.
Okay.
Okay.
Latency.
So,
Okay.
we can get started.
No, I don't. We don't need to. Yeah. Okay. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Todd McGowan. And for the first time, I don't have a bunch of people listing a bunch of things that I've written or anything, because I'm not going to say anything like that. Although I am going to say one thing to start out. So Preston said I was literally deported, and that is actually true. But I was teaching 2 days ago, and there was a guest in my class, a screenwriter, and we were asking her questions, and a student went up to the microphone to ask her a question. She says, student says, "I'm literally shitting my pants right now because I'm so excited to talk to you." And I said, "I don't think that's what that word means exactly." But I guess you can't say I'm metaphorically shitting my pants right now. Anyway, but that's not really the joke that I'm going to start out with, because all the jokes are at the end. So just, it's a way to kind of make you not want to leave. Okay, so I also have this thing here. So if I look down at that, I won't look down at that. I'll just look at you. Okay, so the talk is called Contradiction and Emancipation, and I'm going to look at how contradiction is the source of, has an emancipatory potential attached to it. Okay, so every social order, I think, has contradictions that create points that appear impossible to inhabit from within that order itself, right? So enjoyment derives, I want to argue, from these contradictions because they provide avenues for people to transcend the limits that the society lays down upon them, right? So it's not, and I think it's through this transcendence that emancipation opens up as an enjoyable path. And so that's one of the things that I want to think about, is how emancipation, contradiction, enjoyment all come together. I think someone's Prius is backing up. I don't know. That's true. I have a Prius, and it makes that annoying noise all the time. Okay, so they got to where they were going. So the contradictions of every social order, in other words, create these openings to enjoy, openings to go beyond what's been authorized. And enjoyment, I think, is an imminent transcendence, not an experience of the divine, of course, but a point in which we transcend the limits that the social order places on us, and that these points that can't register in its accounting. Certain positions simply don't exist as social possibilities, but these social impossibilities, contradictory points, represent places where we can enjoy. This point of impossibility is socially impossible, but not ontologically impossible, right? So the position that, so for instance, that sexist society deems impossible, like that there could be a such thing as sexualized mothers, is socially impossible, ontologically, obviously possible. So within any social order, one can do the impossible and occupy this contradictory position that the social order deems impossible. But because occupying this impossible position brings contradiction to light, it entails necessarily ostracism and reprobation. So embracing the contradiction frees one from the dictates of social authority and frees one to enjoy. So enjoyment is possible in every social order, obviously, because no social order is coherent and complete. Every social order is driven by contradiction. So if a social order were coherent and whole, it would have no contradiction, but it would also have no way to bring in new members into it, right? So even a group like the Shakers, I don't know if they're popular up here in America, they were popular, no one had sex in this group, but they still had some way to usher in new members. And so they thus had some way that they suffered from contradiction, right? So they couldn't if there's no contradiction, there's no way to bring in new members, and there's no way to have a social structure. So a society constitutes itself as a whole by creating a barrier between itself and what's external to it. And this contrast between inside and outside is essential for every society. This is how it creates what it deems to be belonging, right? You belong if you're in, you don't belong if you're out. So this dividing line between belonging and non-belonging has to be defined by some social authority. So someone has to say, these people belong, these people don't belong. The problem is that the social authority that says certain people belong, certain people don't belong, has to itself be authorized by who, right? Who's the author? Who's the authority for that authority, right? So this is, I think, this basic contradiction that besets every social order, that the people who are authorizing belonging are themselves unauthorized. And there's no way to get around that, I don't think. So social authority that doles out recognition has the authority through the recognition that the members of the group, their society, give to it, but then it's the one that gives them their authority, their belonging as members of society. So this is, I think, the basic contradiction that every social order suffers from, and thus every social order is necessarily a porous order. So it's one populated by holes of non-belonging that undermine its coherence. So no one can ever be sure that they're belonging because there's no authorized source of authority that could make them convinced that they belong. So this is, I think, again, the fundamental contradiction and the problem, the thing that creates all social incoherence. So one's place, you could say, one's place within the society is never certain, but always on the verge of being lost. So you're always on, even if you feel like you belong, most of all, like Jeff Bezos, someone like that, there still is this fear, like I'm going to slip into non-belonging and I could at any point, right? Okay, so no one wants to confront their non-belonging head on, and yet it's precisely this non-belonging, I think this is the key thing, this failure to totally belong, that's the source of enjoyment. So the contradiction of belonging, the failure of belonging is what makes us able to enjoy. And so the unauthorized status of all social authority leaves the members of society with no assurance that they belong. They strive to belong, but then there's no way that they can be sure that they do. So if one knew that one could belong, I think then one would feel fully recognized within the society, and no one has that position of feeling fully recognized. So I think in this sense, the contradiction is that's the fundamental contradiction that besets every society. So it's through this contradiction is the source of enjoyment because it creates empty spaces within the society where subjects have the ability to do what's not been socially authorized. Okay, so despite their clear appeal of being the clear appeal of things that are authorized, this isn't what creates enjoyment. So belonging, recognition, we take pleasure in them for sure, but they're not what bring enjoyment to us. So there's no enjoyment, I want to say, in fitting in. That the only enjoyment comes with non-belonging, with failing to fit in, even though there's, of course, a pleasure, something appealing about fitting in. So in other words, we enjoy the failure of the social order, the contradiction of the social order, not the way in which we fit into it. We enjoy the points that are beyond the options that the society lays out for us. And we inhabit, when we enjoy, we inhabit this unauthorized space of non-belonging. So even though, again, it's unpleasant not to fit in, I think in a certain way it's enjoyable. And all enjoyment, I want to claim, emerges out of non-belonging from occupying this position of one who doesn't fit. Like when I was sent back today. It wasn't enjoyable. I'm just kidding. That was, well, maybe it was enjoyable. It wasn't pleasurable. It was, especially because they said, you can't even, this is what they told me, you can't get off at the first exit. You have to get off at the second exit in the United States. And so they said, because you won't have Wi-Fi service, so you have to be really in the US, then you can come back. And so that's what I did. Okay, so you could say that emancipation, I think, lives in this blank space within the society where enjoyment can emerge. Enjoyment comes out of or occurs when what cannot happen happens, when the impossible takes place. And obviously, that's a contradictory statement, right? But the contradiction inherent in the statement, I think, is the key to how enjoyment functions, because enjoyment necessarily depends upon some social contradiction. So what the social order formally rules out and deems contradictory nonetheless takes place, even though it doesn't have any social authorization. So the field of possibilities in any society always involves a contradiction. This is the point at which a society makes demands on people that are irreconcilable with each other, right? And this contradiction creates an impossibility or something that can't happen within the existing social configuration. And enjoyment is this experience of the impossible. And I think the genuine political act has to occupy also this place of the impossible. So although it seems like many political struggles just are about conflicting possibilities, I think the real political struggle is always about making the impossible happen. I'm not the first person to say this. So to do the impossible is to break from the field of given possibilities within a society and change the social coordinates. And when a political act accomplishes this, it achieves something, I think, consonant with the radicality of enjoyment. So we enjoy at the site of contradiction within the social order when we, or where we can, do the impossible. Or you can say it another way, to do the impossible is to occupy the point of contradiction. So I think emancipation or emancipatory project is the embrace of this radical enjoyment of contradiction or this enjoyment of non-belonging. So this is visible, I think, in leftist movements throughout human history, from Spartacus revolt in ancient Rome to Haitian Revolution to Russian Revolution to the Dalit Buddhist movement in India to the Zapatista movement in Mexico or to Black Lives Matter in the contemporary US. And I think in each case, the emancipatory project focuses on privileging the fact of non-belonging and taking this non-belonging as the model for the enjoyment that it proffers. So I think the Haitian Revolution nicely shows this logic. So Napoleon sends troops to Haiti to re-enslave the island after the successful revolution. But the Haitian soldiers confronted the French, interestingly, I think, not as enemies to be ruthlessly eliminated, but as fellow participants in the universal struggle for emancipation who had lost their way, which is why they sang to them the revolutionary song of the French Revolution and said, "You're on the wrong side, come fight with us." So the Haitian troops did not sing Haitian songs to the soldiers of the French Revolution, but they sang songs about universal songs, about the contradiction within French society that made it possible for a universal emancipatory project. So I think this episode from the Haitian Revolution reveals what emancipatory non-belonging looks like. It provides an opening for the adversary to join the struggle and absolutely refuses to place the adversary in the position of the enemy. I think this is a very crucial distinction. In English, we have this nice, I think it's true in French too, the adversary of enemy. I think it's a nice distinction between adversary and enemy. What's more, I think that neither blood nor history nor symbolic identity determines participation in a group of non-belonging, because this group has no external barrier to keep it to form its coherence, right? So it's able to exist within this contradictory space. So those who don't belong in a society and receive little to no recognition become, in a certain sense, the focus of emancipation. From the perspective of emancipation, figures of non-belonging are not exceptions to the rule, but paradigms for all subjectivity. The subject is defined by its failure to belong, its inability to fit within the assigned places for it within the social order. This failure, again, is what opens up the possibility for enjoyment. But if you attempt to belong to the social order, you're fleeing subjectivity and fleeing this possibility. So emancipation, recognizes that non-belonging actually harbors all of the social order's enjoyment. It's not just an exceptional position that we should strive to eliminate, but actually the basic form for all enjoying subjectivity that becomes obfuscated by those who strive constantly to belong. So even the people, even though people who are reduced to non-belonging have no social advantages and obviously suffer tremendous oppression, they make evident the limits of the social order that emerges through its contradictions. So enjoyment emanates from the position of non-belonging that the social authority doesn't recognize. So recognizing the universality of non-belonging, I think, is the emancipatory project. So the left, emancipation, enjoys the social order's internal failure, its contradiction, no matter what the structure of the social order is. So it's positioned at this point of shared non-belonging, no matter what the society, what the larger social form is, I think. So there's no, but this leftist structure, again, has no enemy, has only an adversary that it tries to bring in. I think it's interesting contrast with the right. So the right, I think, is a rejection of impossible contradiction and an attempt to assert belonging in contrast to those who accept non-belonging. So conservatism, I think, offers the image of belonging to its adherents at the cost of relegating others to non-belonging. That's, I think, the basic structure of what conservative or right-wing thinking does. So the rightist enjoys through the figure that it despises, because this figure actually brings the conservative in touch with the contradiction. So again, it's not like there's a separate right-wing or left-wing enjoyment. Instead, it's the conservative, through the figure that they point out as an enemy, then enjoys through that figure of the enemy, through that figure of non-belonging. So in this sense, I think right-wing politics is necessarily parasitic on a leftist or an emancipatory project. Or you could say, like, right-wing politics, I think, is replete with enemies because that's who provides it with the enjoyment that fuels it. That's why there's no such thing as a right-wing project that doesn't have an enemy. If there's no enemy, the right, the conservative will have to create one, because the right enjoys through the enemy. The enemy is the figure who occupies the position of social contradiction, and the enemy acts as the source of enjoyment to fuel the right-wing project. So the conservative, again, parasitically partakes of this enjoyment of non-belonging through the figure of the enemy. And I think it's interesting contrast with the leftist project, right? So the rightist, I think, will attempt to forge belonging for a particular group, but it always founders on the problem of contradiction that undermines the belonging. So whereas emancipation, I think, takes non-belonging and contradiction as the fuel that drives it, this is what actually undermines the conservative or right-wing project. So I think you might say there's a kind of opposition between the two. Is the leftist project is always tenuous because there's no clear border between those who don't belong and other people who don't belong. Whereas the right-wing project is always undermined by the fact that the more that it's kind of constantly trying to destroy an enemy, but the more that it destroys it, the more that it destroys the very thing that fuels it. So I think this contrast between, and this is the promised jokes that are coming. So this contrast between left and right, I think, is interestingly brought out in the area of comedy. And it's very sad to me that that it's not the case that just leftists are funny and people on the right are not funny. I wish that was true, but it's not. That's not true, and it's also the reverse is not true. I have not friends, relatives, let's say, that are conservative, and they claim, okay, everyone on the left has no sense of humor. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Every leftist I know is much funnier than you. But that's why I don't speak to my relatives anymore after I sent them, or they don't speak to me, I should say. Anyway, but I think there's this interesting, you can see this difference between embrace of contradiction and need for the enemy in left-wing and right-wing conservative emancipatory humor. Okay, so I think conservative jokes always operate according to the logic of belonging, non-belonging, or to put it in language of Carl Schmitt, friend, enemy, right? They do necessarily. So this type of joke identifies a contradiction. I think all jokes have to do this within the enemy who doesn't belong, and they find humor in that, but there's no contradiction between, on the side of the person that belongs, right? So you identify the contradiction in the other, but not in yourself. So that's conservative comedy. So conservative comedy has people who belong that it refuses to make fun of, whereas emancipatory comedy, a genuine emancipatory comedy, actually accepts no such limitations and sees the contradiction within everyone and finds comedy in the contradiction. So the right-wing structure becomes apparent in almost any, I think, anti-communist joke. Some of these are even pretty good, I think. So I'll give you a standard one. So what's the best way to kill a communist? Yes, sorry. What's the best way to kill a communist? Communism. It's not bad. It's just funny. Okay. So it correctly apprehends, I think, right, the self-destructive manifestations of actual communist experiments in the 20th century. Cress and I were just joking about how many people were killed under Maoism earlier. I'm sorry. We were joking about it. We were talking about it. That was a terrible joke because we weren't joking about that. Anyway, so this is a right-wing joke, okay? Why it's a right-wing joke? Because it postulates the communist as the enemy that succumbs to contradiction, right? Communism destroys communists, contradiction, but it leaves the anti-communist, the one who tells the joke, say, totally intact, right? Not subjected to contradiction. So that the anti-communist is undivided and can position communism in the position of the enemy to be annihilated. So that's how we know it's a right-wing joke, because it preserves the anti-communist as a substantial entity. So conservative enjoyment, again, confines itself to those who belong, those who aren't communists, to go back to this joke. While communists in the joke suffer from contradiction, the anti-communist, again, telling the joke does not. Right? So that's the thing. But what's interesting is the anti-communist enjoys through the communist, right? I think the joke makes that perfectly clear. Okay. So this form of enjoyment is necessarily particular and cannot accede to the universal, right? Because there's a communist enemy, like communism is wiped out. If it were to become universal, it would lose the exclusivity that gives it its conservative hue. So through this insistence on belonging, rightist conservative enjoyment depends upon the enemy that its jokes turn into the source of mockery, a mockery correctly, I think, identifies the enemy as lacking, as contradictory, but leaves the friend, again, Schmidt's terms, unstained by contradiction. That's a problem. But emancipation, I think, in contrast, finds enjoyment within its own contradiction. And this enjoyment is universal because contradiction inheres in every identity, every social order, and it's the source of the enjoyment, which I think becomes clear. I apologize if any of you, maybe I've told this joke sometime before. The only time I remember telling it was to my class. I don't think any of you have ever had a class at the University of Vermont with me, so, but I probably have told it before too many times. Anyway, so let's look at this joke. This is, I think, an emancipatory leftist joke that is about the way in which everyone gets subjected to contradiction. So here's the joke. So a visitor goes to a monastery. Oh, I've told this joke before. I still feel terrible. Okay, I can tell people looked at each other. I've got to come up with a whole new joke. No, I can't do it. I can't do it. I do it. So the visitor goes to a monastery, and one of the monks agrees to be his guide, right? And so he takes him around for the day, and finally they come to it's dinner time. They go to the dining hall, and all of a sudden they start to eat, and one of the other monks yells out 15, and then the whole dining hall cracks up. And the visitor goes to the other monk. He's like, "What was so funny? That didn't seem very funny. It's a number." And the guy goes, "We've all been together for so long that we just have numbers for our jokes, and we don't fully tell the whole joke, right?" And so the guy goes, "Okay, all right, that makes sense." And then all of a sudden another young monk yells out 56, and there's a little less laughter, but people are still laughing. And the guy goes, "What happened there?" And the guy goes, "Well, that joke was fine, just wasn't as funny as the first joke." And the guy was like, "Oh, okay." And then he's like, "Oh, I kind of get it now." And he goes, "I'm going to try one myself." And he yells out 125, and the whole place just bursts out laughing in the dining hall. And then the visitor turns to the monk and he goes, "Wow, I must have got the best joke." And the monk says to him, No, we've never heard that one before. So again, what's great about that, I think, like that joke. So what's great about this monastery, though, is that everyone is laughing at something that they don't know, right? Like so that no one is exempted from being the butt of the joke, because the joke is precisely about this contradiction. And I think the best part of it is it shows that the group that belongs, the group who knows what the joke is about, is zero, right? No one belongs. And I think that's to me, this is, I can't remember if I don't think I invented it. I think I took this joke from someone, but which makes me, I think I can say this then. I think it's the best leftist joke ever made. But I didn't invent it. I think I stole it from someone. I just maybe embellished the little parts, which is, I think that's a good, like, do you know that? I think it's true. I think we should never say anyone invented a joke, because I think there's something paranoid about even thinking that. Like the big other invents every joke. And so to think like I invented it, I don't think we should ever think we invented a joke. We just embellish it a little bit. Okay, anyway, so the point is that the non-belonging is not in the joke a new form of belonging, like, oh, there's all the people that get, no. Like the non-belonging remains and the contradiction remains, and that's what makes the joke work, I think. So there's no point at which someone becomes excluded from the group of non-belonging that constitutes the people laughing at the joke, right? Or that are in on the joke, or that know what the joke is, because no one does. All right, so this enjoyment, I think, of the joke doesn't rely on an enemy and relies precisely on the social contradiction that it brings forth and makes evident. Okay, so just a kind of last couple words. So the left enjoys what's not there, I think, like the joke that the visitor in the monastery tells, and the non-existence of this joke, I think, corresponds to the number that he yells out when he's saying it, to the number of the joke. So we laugh together, I think, at the impossible position that the joke itself occupies, and that the contradiction that it implies. So I think in emancipatory comedy, there's no position immune to the reach of contradiction, and social contradiction is what gets exposed by an emancipatory comic act, I think. So the emancipation is, I want to say, the enjoyment of contradiction, the point at which the symbolic structure ceases to hold, or when its failure becomes evident. So because contradiction extends everywhere, this enjoyment can never be exclusive. Instead, you don't have to have someone barred from it for another person to experience. Some don't have to suffer so that others can enjoy. Instead, you might say all suffer so that no one is excluded from enjoyment. So this contrast between the anti-communist joke and the monastery joke, I think makes, to me, clear the difference between conservatism, emancipation, right and left. So as the contrast between the two jokes suggests, right and left are not so much two opposed ways of looking at the world. I think this is really important, so I'm going to end on, but rather two opposed structures of enjoyment, or two different ways of relating to contradiction, right? So the rightist way of relating to contradiction is to try to make it as if contradiction doesn't exist, even though it's impossible to get rid of. Whereas I think my version of what leftism is, and what I see as leftist in the world, is an embrace of contradiction, right? Is a full embrace of it, and an attempt to access the enjoyment that's present at the point of contradiction. So if right-wing political activity has an inherent advantage over leftism, it seems today that is true. I think it consists with the facility with which the right can structure a path to enjoyment, even though it's not so evident, right? So the right-wing path requires an enemy, but I think it's much more difficult, the left path, to conceive of this enjoyment of absence or of contradiction. But I think that's the only way to get out of the right-wing morass. Okay, thanks. It's only 30 minutes. That's
spot on.
Spot on, okay.
30 seconds over.
30. I was too much extemporizing.
But had I introduced you like I should have,
Then it would have gone way long. Okay, all right. So should we do questions? Okay, none. So, yeah, sorry. Okay.
One question I had was, well, why is the second joke a leftist joke? It's like the first joke is clearly anti-communist.
Right.
The second joke is like about Washington. Yeah, like is it? It's not political in the same way, clearly, but like, why is it a left?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry for the thing. Yeah, so the question is why the second joke was a left joke. Yes. Okay. And you're right. And the point, and also part of the question was that the first question was clearly right wing because it was targeted targeted communism. And you're right, like in the level of content, there's nothing that makes that second joke leftist at all, right? Like it's just, for me, it's just the form of the joke. And I thought the form of the joke, that its attention to contradiction, the fact that he's telling it, everyone's laughing at a joke that they don't know what it is, that's contradictory. So I like that, that's contradictory. But then I also really, I think the main thing for me that makes it leftist is that the group of people that know what the joke is, that are in on the joke, is zero. And so that suggests that they're enjoying their non-belonging, like they're all laughing at something they're not in on, right? So they're enjoying precisely their failure to belong to the social structure, right? And so that's for me, that's what I think leftism is. Like that's just how I would define it. So, yeah, that's a good question.
Questions in the back here?
Yeah, Carl. Oh, yeah.
I was wondering, when talking about the determinism and how they like want to bring in the French Revolution, I was wondering if you could elaborate on how bringing the French into their revolution was a contradiction.
Yeah, so they're right. So the point was that the question is how is the Haitian soldiers trying to bring the French over to their side, a contradiction in belonging. I just think it shows that here's my point in bringing that up, right? So it shows that they didn't, so the French were clearly their adversaries, right? Clearly they were coming to kill them or re-enslave them. But they didn't look at them as their adversaries. They said, they looked at them as their adversaries, not their enemies. So they didn't say, we're just going to slaughter all the French. What they said is, you're fighting on the wrong side. And C.L.R. James in his book, The Black Jacobins, is a great book about this. And his account of this is really moving, I think. And his point is, look, they said to the and by singing the songs of the like La Marseillaise and the Sahara, they were signaling to them that the French soldiers were on the anti-revolutionary wrong side. And so they treated them as an adversary, not as an enemy. That was the reason why I brought that example. But yeah, it's a good question. Like, which you can only do that if you're not committed to the idea of belonging, right? Like once you're committed to the idea of belonging, you need an enemy. You absolutely have to because the only thing that cements your belonging is the existence of the enemy, right? Like you belong because we know who the enemy is. Otherwise, your identity, there's nothing to authorize it.
We have a question from Colin Cox from online. That's a good question here. I'm going to say the question here for Todd. What would you say any left-wing project that identifies enemy or other is actually a covert, unintentional, right-wing, exclusive one? So, for example, he says, what should we make of the left's resistance to the figure of someone like Trump?
Oh, but okay.
Want to repeat that?
No, I got it. As long as everyone, can they hear it on the thing?
Yeah, they can.
Yeah, okay.
Just acknowledge Colin, your student.
Yeah, Colin. Yeah, hi, Colin. Can I just say this is like 30 seconds delayed. So I have to see myself in the past. It's hard enough. I never look in the mirror. Like I shave my head in the shower. I hate looking in the mirror. And so it's even worse. So I'm like in the past, it's even worse of me. I look even worse before. Okay. If it's possible, right? That's what Crossan just said, if it's possible. Yeah, it's a good question, but I don't think, here's the thing, like, I don't think my sense is that the anti-Trump position is a thoroughly liberal position. Like, I don't think that that's a leftist, sorry, I don't think that's a leftist position. And every leftist I know is just like, well, Trump's just symptom of whatever, like capitalist structure, you know, so I don't, so yeah, I think that's right. Like liberalism needs an enemy. Like, I think that's a real, I think that's, so liberalism does need figures like Trump, right? But I don't think an emancipatory leftist project, like, obviously I'm against Trump, but I don't I don't have this like CNN obsession with Trump, right? Like and so that's what I would say to that. Like, you know, I just don't, and it is true. But I would say about the first part, yeah, I think there's a lot of like quasi leftist projects that need an enemy, and then they become right-wing projects. Like, I don't know, that seems to me to be a pretty good understanding of what happened under Stalin. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't, yeah, Carla?
Yes, I just want to help us, maybe scholars receive your work, because we have made some claims that really contradict a lot of what has been believed. A lot of the things that we build on.
Yeah, Carla. So Carla just asked, how have Hegelian scholars received my work? And that I have that's an easy question to answer. They just haven't received it at all. So they haven't rejected it. They don't care. So yeah, it's easy. So yeah, which is fine, right? Like, you know, that's their prerogative. I have to say, like, more people have, this is like warms the cockles of my heart, like more people have reached out to me about that book on Hegel than anything else I've ever done. So that's fine. If like Robert Brandom doesn't want to say anything, that, you know, it's probably for the best, right? Like, I don't know, if he read my book, he might, you know what would happen? I think, I'm going to be very graphic, but he has a really long, like Hobbit, like beard. And I think he would like vomit. It would get all in his beard. It would be disgusting. So I hope he doesn't ever read it. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question that maybe nuances a little bit the question about Trump.
Yeah.
So what is your definition of, like, what is the difference between enemy and the other? Because it's so important, the other is so important in, you know, identifying the soul for it, whatever.
Yeah.
In constructing the world.
Yeah.
What is the difference?
So, okay, so good. So the question is, what is the difference between enemy and other? And so I also use the term adversary, right? So an enemy is someone who I require to be opposed to me so that I can be myself, right? So I need, so like during Cold War, right? So to be American meant to be, you know, Soviet Union as your enemy. So that, but other, I think, is very, so adversary is someone who's just assaulting your position, and you can try to, you know, whatever, you try to negotiate with them, deal with them, bring them over to your side. Other, I think, so other is, and I think your question is hinting at this, other is absolutely necessary for me to, I'm constantly interacting with others. Like, I don't believe, in certain ways I break from Jacques Lacan, but this is the way I totally follow him. Like, I don't believe in intersubjectivity. Like, I think we just interact with others, and that's what we do, right? So that's what I would say. Like, I think there's no, you know, they're not necessarily enemies. Like, Preston isn't he's just an other that I'm interacting with, right? So I think and I think one of the things that we do is that we constitute ourselves through our relationship to the otherness, right? Like, without it, like, our subjectivity, especially the way in which, I mean, this is a whole other question, right? Like, our desire only emerges through that relation to the other, whereas I don't think, your question was about the difference. I don't think our desire necessarily emerges through our relation to the enemy, right? Like, here's what I would say I would say, it's interesting. I think you enjoy through the enemy, or the conservative enjoys through the enemy. But I think you desire through the other. So I think there's a difference. It's like, that's right.
We have a question from someone online. We have a question here, by all means. So this question was asked by one of our PhD researchers. Yes, how do we form communities? Okay, so you're the one, you're the authority on this. Okay, how do we form communities that embrace contradiction and make space for difference? Is that possible? Can you tell us how to do it?
Yeah, I don't like doing that. I mean, I think that part of the thing I would say is, I don't think it's necessarily the theory's job to give advice like that, because I think though we should try to understand how it happened. Like one of the things, so one of the motivations for what I just said, this talk I gave, was just seeing what happened in Black Lives Matter and the way, which this didn't happen very much, but it happened occasionally, where the cop would come and kneel down with them. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Like what, they don't care. They didn't say to the cop, like, you know, like, fuck you, cop, stay on your own side, we hate you. No, they're like, okay, good, you're kneeling down with us, all right. So I think that to me would be an example, Preston, of the way in which theory just tries to find the already articulated idea and then try to make it manifest. So I haven't thought about this, but like, I would imagine there are already situations where that structure exists, right? Like there, you know, like this, I mean, I think that monastery, this is why I like that joke so much, like that monastery situation seems like one of them, but obviously that's not a real life thing. But I don't know. I mean, my other example, this is my other favorite example. I'm sorry, this is not real life. It's from a film. It's from this film, Heathers. I don't know if you know it. I think it's one of the great masterpieces of all. So there's like Citizen Kane, and then there's Heathers. I think I'm joking. I am not joking. And it ends with, so the whole thing is about popular kids being killed, which, okay, I'm not for necessarily, but at the end, throughout the film, the popular kids just treat the people that don't belong with complete contempt and mockery and derision. And at the end, there's one of the popular girls left ruling the school, and this other woman comes up to her, it's played by Winona Ryder. Her name's Veronica. And she takes her red bow off of her hair to like passing the torch, and she says, "There's a new sheriff in town." And I'm like, okay, what's she gonna do? You know what she does? She goes to the most ostracized person in the school, and she goes, "My date flaked out on me for prom." He blew himself up. You want to rent some videos and pop some popcorn? And then she's like, "Sure, it sounds fun." So that to me is a great example of like, by the way, there's a lot of teen films that I think do this, where there's a certain structure in place, and then all of a sudden the figure of like non-belonging becomes a possibility in the end. Like, so that would be my example.
Yes, okay, so
Yeah.
over here.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how you saw your category of like, or your idea of emancipatory non-belonging in terms of like health status, so like those like disability, and how that would interact in terms of it being emancipatory.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, you're right. So you said people labeled this with disability, right? So what I would say is, I think that, sorry, yeah. So the question is, how does emancipatory non-belonging fit in with?
Or how would you view your category of emancipatory non-belonging in terms of people like experiencing being labeled with disability, but also how that is an embodied experience of suffering?
Right. Okay. So the question is, how does my category of, that be my category, but okay, my category of emancipatory non-belonging, how does that apply to fit in with people who have been labeled disabled or people who embody disability? Yes. Okay. So I would say a couple things to that. I would say, first of all, one of the ways that is every society today? I think probably it is. Every society today tries to create belonging by labeling disability as a thing, right? Like, as you don't belong because you're disabled. So that would be the first thing I would say, that one of the, like, there's a certain universality of disability. Now, of course, there's particular differences, right? So that's obviously, but I think one of the ways that capitalist society functions is that it sees disability as a real brake on its productivity. And so to see that break on its productivity as what's really universal about all of us. And that, so I think that that's the emancipatory gesture. That's what I would say. So I think, I mean, I would, rather than seeing that as a particular category, I would want to see that as a category of universality. I think that applies to everyone. Again, not people's level of disability is different, right? But no one escapes it. I don't think.
More questions?
No, I'm fine. Whatever. Yeah.
Is someone else at the same table?
Yeah.
What is your name?
Kevin.
Kevin, thanks.
Kevin.
My question is about the idea of leftist belonging or leftist enjoyment coming from non-belonging.
Yeah.
And just thinking of some historical examples where leftist projects did, I would think, label an enemy that was opposed to them. Like, for instance, Lenin and the bourgeoisie, or Castro and the imperialists, or even the example you used before, Mao, calling landlords the sort of enemy, and then creating a sort of category of belonging that divided society in this way. And it seems as though there was a friend-enemy distinction in that leftist project, a la Schmidt or Roof or whatever. And it seems like there is enjoyment that comes from the creation of like a sort of hegemonic leftist society or communist society. So I was wondering what you thought about like that, those kind of like examples of leftists seeming to gain enjoyment through belonging.
Yeah. So the question is haven't there been historically a lot of leftist projects that have used belonging and created an enemy? Yeah. I don't know, this is going to sound so arrogant. I don't think they're leftists. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just don't. I think once you do that, sorry, like I think that there's like you can have right-wing deviations, right? Like that, I think that and yeah, you're right. Like there's a lot of enjoyment in that, but it's all enjoyment through the figure of the enemy, right? Freud has this great line. I'm not totally like Freudian critique of Marxism, but in this case, he's like, I wonder with trepidation what the Soviets will do after they've killed the last bourgeois, right? Okay, so that's not a bad point, right? Like, so I just think that I mean, that, I guess in a certain way, what I'm working on is emerged in response to that. Like part of it is I couldn't understand why friends of mine even felt like they had to like apologize, like we have to defend Lenin or we have to defend even Mao or stuff. Like, I just wanted to say no, okay, that's a rightist deviation. We don't have to defend that as a leftist. Like why do we have to defend that? I hate how arrogant that sounds, but I just think that those are right-wing deviations within. That they miss out on. I mean, look, of course, like the whites were trying to destroy the Soviet project, right? So of course they have to be like, if they're fighting, if they come with tanks, you got to do something, right? So I'm not against that. I'm not against self-defense, but you're right. Like vis-a-vis the peasantry, vis-a-vis the So I think those are problems, and those are right-wing deviations. That's what.
Let's go to a question that was asked on our screen here. And this one comes from Alexandra from Chile. And the question is, would self-determination be a viable alternative to embracing contradiction? Self-determination versus contradiction.
Okay, so I mean, obviously I'm not against self-determination, but I guess there's a lot of problems with that because there's a certain ego psychology behind that idea of like, this constitutes the self. And I mean, like my idea of the self would be the self is already contradictory. So in a certain sense, self-determination would be embracing contradiction. It would have to be, right? Because there's no self that's not contradictory. Like, I don't know, like I'm drinking this, it's like a cucumber flavored seltzer, and part of me thinks it's terrible, and part of me thinks it's great. It's contradictory, right? Like, I don't know, I can't decide. I'm just gonna take it again.
Great.
Same thing, it's both. So that's what I would say, like, self-determination is embrace of contradiction.
Question here. The idea is, you have another question, yes, please.
Carl,
Yes, I was thinking also about possibilities before you mentioned except that today we did not work. But the field of possibility seems to be reduced with the amounts of data that it's analyzed and everybody says that we not. But it is a reality, something that's happening. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on the way technology right now is shaping us.
yeah. Yeah, I'll repeat it. So the question is, how is technology shaping the field of possibilities and the field of the impossible, right? Like I think there's a sense in which, I wonder if this is essentially your question, in which the field of the impossible is shrinking because the possibles are being determined more and more and more. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Although I have to say, I don't know if anyone else does this, but I go on the elliptical to YouTube, and their little algorithm, it's the stupidest thing ever. It never picks up things that I really want to see. So I always have to do a new search for, like, I want to see the latest Jacques Rancière. What's it take? They can put a Jacques Rancière. They can't do it. They said they give me all these things for, like, famous. I don't know how I get all these, like, actors, whatever. And so part of me is, this is a stupid way to answer the question, but part of me wants to say, no, those things that seem to be dictating our, like, they're actually not doing that good of a job, right? Like they're like that technological thing that seems to be all encompassing is itself full of fissures, right? And it's contradictory as well. So I'm not, I mean, maybe this is naive, but I'm not sanguine about technology, but I'm also not like one of these, even though I don't know how to use it. I'm not fearful, totally fearful.
Well, thank you so much. Let's keep talking.
No, let's not do that. Thank you for coming. Thanks everyone. You're very patient with me. So
We can stay after a beverage is on the house, on me, or on GCAS. So stick around. Love to get to know you and talk and strategize about education. Thanks a lot.
thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's really good. Great.